Hello, this is Samo Guy in Hawaii, and this was originally going to be a comparison between the D.N.A. and the plasma coil. But comparing anything to the plasma coil is kind of pointless. The plasma coil exemplifies the concept of overpowered, and I want to use that in a discussion of balance and how Borderlands 3 currently works, but I will save that for another video. For now, we will go over the plasma coil and how it does what it does, which is pretty straightforward, but spend more time on the D.N.A., which is fun but not straightforward. Okay, these are both Molly 1 SMGs. The D.N.A. has been an underperformer since it first appeared in April of 2020. After a number of buffs on 14 January 2021, however, it's now quite effective and fun if used properly. The Plasma Coil, by contrast, is an Arms Race DLC exclusive that's been a stellar performer since day one and is still, as of this post, arguably the best SMG in the game. Let's look at each. Now, the Plasma Coil is a relatively standard Molly 1 SMG that benefits from very high base damage, ridiculously high rates of fire, good projectile speed, and large magazine sizes. It also does splash damage and has reasonably average charge times. Its only quirks are a short pause in full auto every 16 rounds and a fixed shock radiation elemental pairing. That pause, by the way, occurs every 16th round regardless of mag size. It's why plasma coils only come with 48 and 64 round mags, despite what it says in part listings. Both numbers are divisible by 16. If skills or gear increase that mag size, it's every 16th round from whatever becomes the resulting maximum magazine size. Okay, it gets trickier with ammo regen mechanics, but by and large, every 16 rounds, there's a pause. Now, I assume both the pause and fixed elements are meant to keep the gun from being too powerful. If so, that's a big fail, Gearbox. Okay, as implied earlier, the plasma coil is so good, it has the ability to make otherwise mediocre builds great. Okay, now there are 54 different variants based on parts. Here are the listed performance stat ranges. You can mix or you can min-max if you want, given the roughly 36 to 44k base damage range at level 65 and 10. But you don't really need to. If you need to do that to be effective, the gun variant is not the issue, it's the build. Okay. The D.N.A., as mentioned, was nothing special until a recent buff. It's now pretty good and potentially very good, but it has a lot of quirks. Okay, it's first cousin to the Cutsman in that it fires projectiles that subsequently split into two orbs with a charged cord extending between them. These projectiles are elemental, any element except radiation. Said element determined randomly. This is why it has no listed elemental damage information, but it is considered an elemental weapon for skills like Amara's Deep Well, and it can pro status effects like most elemental weapons. The distance between split orbs, however, is shorter than Cutsman ones, very short, and the orientation of the line formed between the orbs depends on the element. Incendiary is always horizontal, corrosion vertical, shock 45 degrees in one direction, cryo 45 in the other. They're also slow and follow imprecise trajectories. Now, like the Cutsman, these projectiles can occasionally pass through enemies without hitting or doing damage, but this is a minor issue. This happens to Cutsman rounds after the split if the enemy is only hit by the cord. Okay, this rarely happens in actual D.N.A. gameplay though because the cord is so short. I only really notice the issue when testing on the Jack dummy or occasionally against a technical. There are also other times when they can hit and proc a status effect, but without any of the associated effects of the element, adding no damage over time or cryo sheen. Again, though, I only noticed during testing against a technical. If either of these last two occur during actual gameplay, either it happens so infrequently that I can't spot it, or it doesn't happen at all, but I at least had to mention it. These rounds can also do greatly increased splash damage, just like the Cutsman SMG or Red Queen grenade, when they hit properly. I had to do some research and testing to understand this, but just like the Cutsman and Red Queen, it happens when we hit with only one of the two orbs after the split. This means there's a minimum range under which the effect won't occur, namely before the split. We have to be far enough away from the target for the split to occur. Even then, proccing this effect is still harder to do than the Cutsman for several reasons. One, the cord is so short. Okay, we're much more likely to either hit with both orbs or miss completely, unless we can get the target to sit still. Okay, and even then, it's hard to do at range given the slow projectile speed and erratic trajectories. Okay. Second, the orientation of the cord, based on elements as mentioned, comes into play. Incendiary rounds will proc if the split round just skirt either side of the target. Corrosion won't do it unless we skirt, the top or top edges of the target or the bottom edges if that's possible. And cryo and shock are a little of both depending on which side we hit. So in theory, if we aim our rounds just so, we can optimize this effect for specific elements. In practice, it's really hard. Again, given the slow projectile speed, erratic trajectories, and the fact that it's random, and the fact that few enemies sit still, it's really hard to be that precise, even at short or medium ranges, okay? In practice, I just try to vary my aim around the edges of a crit spot whenever possible, okay? If we proc this on a crit spot, we do at least double the damage. This is also why it tends to be easier versus adds and mobs, and harder versus bosses, and even then it takes practice. If we aim around the edges and miss completely too much, we start losing out on base DPS and damage over time, okay? The amount of damage it can do, however, is so great that it's worth putting in the effort. But let's talk about the damage. This table shows the performance range of all 189 D.N.A. variants post-buff. Damage, rate of fire, reload time, and magazine size are quite good now, and this does not show the increased projectile speed or reduced charge time. This is for level 65 and 10. This table shows the base damage per second, or DPS, of a particular set of variants with elemental damage numbers versus specific target types. Remember that DPS calculations assume continuous fire except for reloading and hitting with every shot, so these are ideal numbers. These numbers also assume every round is the same element matched against one target type, which in reality never happens. Okay, as mentioned before, the element for any given round is determined randomly. So we may get 3, 4, or 5 rounds of the same element in a row at times, but on average, a quarter of our shots will be fire, a quarter shock, a quarter corrosion, and a quarter cryo. So a more accurate estimate of DPS are these numbers, which average out the 4 elemental numbers. This is what we might reasonably expect to do versus each target type. Now notice that the numbers are pretty close to each other, regardless of target type. So while random elements won't achieve the damage dealing efficiency of the right element versus specific target type, we get consistent performance versus every target type without swapping weapons or firing modes. Okay, roughly 40 to 43k base DPS for this particular variant, level 65 and 10. This is one advantage to using the D.N.A. These numbers, by the way, are not for the highest or lowest base damage variant, but rather the highest possible base DPS given the right parts. I actually selected variants with the highest rate of fire and projectile speed, which turned out to be the highest DPS performers. I did that for a couple of reasons. One, the single biggest issue with the D.N.A., based on my experience anyway, is projectile speed, especially versus moving or worse flying targets. The faster the projectile, the easier it is to target and actually hit a moving enemy. Two, to recap, the D.N.A. does damage 3 ways, not counting melee. Base damage, the projectile hitting a target, okay, the base DPS we already talked about, damage over time if we proc a status effect, and the bonus splash damage we covered. Okay, increased rate of fire improves all of these. Higher rates of fire send more rounds downrange in a given period of time, so higher DPS. It also means more chances to proc that special bonus splash damage. And damage over time, well, how does increased rate of fire increase damage over time? Well, for most weapons, it actually doesn't. What it does increase is the chance to proc damage over time. If we fire 5 rounds per second and hit with all 5, we have 5 chances to proc a status effect per second. Okay, if we double our rate of fire, that's 10 chances in a second to roll the dice and hope RNG smiles on us. Okay, a damage over time status effect for a single element gun, once procced, however, just needs to be procced again before its duration expires. Okay, if a gun's given rate of fire can do that consistently, damage over time is maxed out. Okay, increasing rate of fire won't increase damage over time in those situations. If you're confused, there's a link to a video I did explaining damage over time in this video's description. The D.N.A., however, is different. It is the only weapon I know of with the potential to get 4 different status effects going at the same time, 3 of which can do damage over time. Okay, the only weapon that comes close is the Tsunami, which can do 2. Okay, so fire, shock, and corrosion doing damage over time, plus cryo, which slows and can freeze. Assuming we can get that to happen, what does that look like? Well, here's an expansion of the DPS table with damage over time figures. Here we don't have to average anything. Once we get a particular elemental dot going, it's going to do its damage per second for at least 3, 5, or 7 seconds. Okay. If we get more than one type of elemental dot going at once, we don't average numbers. We add them. Okay. If we get all 3 going, it looks like this. Again, ignoring the slowing and the freezing effects of cryo. In a nutshell, getting 3 dots going at once, fire, shock, and corrosion, does on average between 6 and 8 times base DPS. I know of no other weapon that can potentially do that. Okay, so the big question then is, can we actually get 4 status effects going at once and maintain them? Well, if it's just the gun by itself, no. The unlisted percentage chance is probably around 30%. And when we divide that by 4, because 4 different random elements, 3% is not enough to get and maintain more than maybe 2 going consistently. If, however, we use skills, gear, and perks that directly or indirectly increase status effect chance, we can. Okay, I've done it. If I fire on this enemy, stop, and then go to photo mode, we can see fire, shock, and corrosion dots all going at the same time. Okay, cryo is a little harder to spot, but the point here is damage over time from just the gun is maxed out. Now, I'm not going to go over the specific skills and gear that allow me to do this because I don't want this video to go on forever. Just be aware that anything that increases status effect chance or increases rate of fire will help. Increased mag size and decreased reload time can also help. Increased projectile speed is also a plus, which is why I took heavy rain on this Amara build. Amara can also increase status effect duration, which reduces the need to proc effects frequently to keep them going. Okay, whatever your Vault Hunter, experiment with the gun and spec your character appropriately if you want to maximize dot damage. Now, as for the bonus splash damage, which as mentioned can be tricky to proc consistently, when we do proc it, we actually do even more damage per second than our dots. We know this kind of intuitively both by looking at test footage and looking at actual combat footage. We've seen test footage where the damage figures suddenly just multiply. Okay, in actual combat, you can see the effect on enemy health. The slower but steady eating away of the damage bar is base DPS and damage over time. The sudden removal of significant chunks, however, that's the bonus splash effect. Remember the way the Cutsman could mow down bosses before it was nerfed and Mayhem was reworked? It's that effect. Now, it won't mow down big bosses the same way as I mentioned, but it will do a lot of damage very quickly. It will mow through most mobs if we can get it to proc. Now, for humanoid enemies, I tend to just aim at or around the head, the crit spot. It depends on the range. This is a Mars, so she can at least grasp a target and hold it steady. Non-humanoid targeting or targets with weird crit spots can vary. Again, tricky to do. If you have more insight on how this effect works, especially versus specific enemies, please let me know in the comments below. In any case, if we combine the right skills and gear and try our best to proc bonus splash, we can handle most of the content in the game and have fun doing it. Now, I have not tried this out on the Guardian Takedown, but I suspect it does just fine. Scale not true. Crystals might be an issue because of self-splash. Anathema and Scourge might be an issue because of the difficulty of getting that bonus splash to proc on large bosses. Molly 1 Takedown, however, is mostly a breeze. I've done MTD over a dozen times with this build, and honestly, the only really challenging part is Wotan's upper half. Remember what I said earlier about dealing with fast, erratically moving targets, especially flying ones? Add the bonus splash damage proccing issues with large targets at range, and there you go. And at times like that, we might want to switch to a different weapon. Like maybe, I don't know. Anyway, thanks for watching.